sixth night over the death of George Floyd. The National Guard deployed in a number of cities as violent clashes between police and protesters continue. Pandemic restrictions ease significantly in some states as the road back to normal continues. And 3 media outlets lose their appeal in the Dylan Voller defamation case. Hello, welcome to ABC News. I'm Karina Carvalho. The US has erupted into a sixth night of protests sparked by the death of unarmed black man George Floyd at the hands of police in Minnesota. Protesters are defying curfews across the country into the night. Riot police have fired tear gas, vehicles have been set on fire, and shops have been looted in several cities. Coast to coast, from Washington to Boston to Miami, Kansas City and San Francisco, at least 40 cities have been gripped in a wave of outrage. And protests have now spread to smaller communities in places such as North Dakota and Nebraska. About 5,000 National Guard troops have been activated in 15 states and Washington, D.C. And more than 4,000 troops are on the streets of Minneapolis, where the unrest began. Authorities say there could soon be nearly 11,000 troops called in. The Los Angeles Police Department is investigating after a police SUV was filmed ramming into protesters during today's demonstrations. A warning, this story may distress some viewers. Social media footage shows the patrol vehicle accelerating into a group of protesters on a Los Angeles street, knocking at least 2 people to the ground before reversing and speeding away. The LAPD says a traffic report was taken and the incident is now under investigation. Nobody was seriously injured. Los Angeles is one of several US cities where a curfew has been imposed and the National Guard deployed to quell unrest. Well, following a day of relatively peaceful rallies in New York City, police and protesters clashed shortly after sunset. Police broke through barricades and chased protesters, making several arrests as bins were set alight. There have been reports of people attempting to break into stores in Manhattan's Soho neighbourhood. The Associated Press is reporting more than 4,000 people have been arrested across the country. A fire in the basement of St. John's Episcopal Church, located opposite the White House in Washington, D.C., has been extinguished. The blaze is one of several lit in the vicinity of the White House as clashes broke out between demonstrators and police. The building is known as the Church of the Presidents, as every president since James Madison has worshipped there. The entire district of Columbia National Guard has now been called in to assist the response to escalating protests. A driver is in police custody after a truck was driven at a crowd of protesters in Minneapolis. The semi-trailer was driving at speed towards thousands of people gathered along a highway before stopping abruptly. It's understood none of the protesters were hurt.
Hey, we cannot hurt him.
In the midst of that crowd, the truck drove through at high speeds, was chased down by protesters, and the truck stopped. The driver was taken out of the truck by the protesters, and he was then taken to Hennepin County Medical Center, as I understand it, or to the closest available medical center for injuries sustained. While at the medical center, he is being taken into custody. The Minnesota State Patrol and the BCA are jointly investigating this case as a criminal matter.
Dr. Uhuru Williams is the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. He says widespread unemployment and a lack of leadership and empathy from the US President Donald Trump have contributed to the unrest.
The reason that this has really taken on national import and spread from coast to coast is that this is a national problem. In fact, we've been fighting 2 pandemics here in the United States, obviously COVID-19, but then the long struggle here in this country against racial inequality, which expresses itself, unfortunately, in the form of police brutality, which we saw Monday night in the case of Mr. Flood. I think there are 3 things that are contributing to what we're seeing in this particular moment. First is the widespread unemployment that's hitting the United States. The fact that this is almost a perfect storm. Many people have compared it to 1968 when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was gunned down in Memphis, Tennessee. We often forget that King was in Memphis to demonstrate on behalf of sanitation workers, but also was in the midst of a national poor people's campaign to address issues of poverty, which are deeply intertwined with racial justice. Second is the use of technology. The reality is that right now we have access to cell phones and other devices that allow us to capture video of incidents like this. And there's a visceral reaction when people can see an officer for more than 8 minutes place their knee on the neck of a suspect, on the neck of Mr. Flood, and literally watch him die, essentially watch him die. And there's a reaction to that. And the third is the fact that we lack federal executive leadership in Washington, D.C. The President of the United States has not shown a great deal of leadership with regard to this incident. And people are frustrated with politicians in general, but I think particularly concerned about the inability of the president to articulate any empathy for what's happening across the country. Health disparity here is an enormous problem. It's certainly a problem in the Twin Cities and Minneapolis, St. Paul. The fact of the matter is that you have that expressed in any number of ways. So in addition to health disparities, we have food deserts. People who live in low-income areas don't have access to fresh produce. In many cases, don't have access to affordable food, affordable housing, adequate education. I like to call it the 6 degrees of segregation. And police brutality or Jim Crow justice is the kind of the crown of that many-headed hydra. The reality is that when we think about this in the context of coronavirus, here are people in this country really trying to make an earnest effort to deal with this pandemic and talking about huge disparity in whom is impacted by it and whether they can get treatment, underlying health causes, which at their core also are tied to racial inequality, and then the disparity in the way that police are treated, or excuse me, people of color are treated at the hands of police. And again, perfect storm coming together and letting people see in a very stark way that this continues to be a major problem in this country. You know, historically, we were dependent on print journalism in order to get the full story of what happened. Rodney King was a game changer here in the United States in 1992 because you had the capturing of the beating of Rodney King by a civilian on camera. And the argument that came back from the police in that case and many other cases is that you didn't see the events leading up to the police violence. The reason that this case, I think, has garnered such attention nationally and internationally is that we've got many angles and so much video that it tells the full story. And in no way was Mr. Flood being resistant to police. In no way was Mr. Flood not compliant. It is a stark reminder in this country that this is the way that Black men and Black women are treated when confronted by police, even when they are trying to comply with police. We saw this in a host of other cases, Tamir Rice and Sandra Bland, and certainly Eric Garner, Michael Brown. But this case in particular, because there's so much video captured from storefront cameras, from cell phone cameras, and we seem to have the complete story, it's a pretty good indication that this was just excessive force and nothing more.
Okay, well, for more on the protests in Los Angeles today, I'm joined by Steve Gregory, who's the national correspondent for iHeart Media. Stephen Gregory, thank you so much for your time tonight. It's about 1 o'clock in the morning there. You've been at multiple protest sites throughout the city of Los Angeles. We know that those protests have spread from areas like Beverly Hills to beachside suburbs like Santa Monica and as well to Long Beach. What's the latest that you can tell us?
Well, things are a little quieter now than they were a few hours ago, that's for sure, Karina. And I can tell you that the challenge here that law enforcement has is that these protests spread rapidly and they go into various pockets around the Southland in the southern basin here in Southern California. And that's been the particular challenge for law enforcement. It is a lot quieter now, again, as I mentioned a few hours ago, and that has a lot to do with the fact that there is a curfew in effect.
Yeah, so how well has that curfew been policed?
Well, here's the thing. So they put out a curfew and they're really counting on people to do the right thing and to adhere to the curfew. But law enforcement are running into pockets of people who are completely in defiance of the curfew order. And there is one community, Santa Monica, who is being very aggressive and they're arresting everyone they come upon. Whereas Long Beach, it's not nearly as they're not as aggressive about getting people, and neither is Los Angeles. They will stop you randomly. I was stopped last night in my news vehicle. I have an unmarked news vehicle, And I was stopped last night, and my vehicle was searched. I was searched. I had my press credentials, and I was questioned, and I was released because I am a member of the media. But not so many people were that lucky, and they are being arrested and they are being detained.
And that's been a really interesting aspect, hasn't it, of these protests that have taken place and turned into riots over the last few nights, that some press have been targeted by police.
Well, not only police, but protesters. And I've been covering protests in many parts of the country for many years. And I got to tell you, I've never seen such hostility from protesters against the media. People were telling me that we're part of the problem, that we're the ones that are distorting the facts and distorting the truth, and we're glorifying the police, and we're doing things that are helping to put fuel on the fire. But also, police have been a little more aggressive to us than normal. In Los Angeles, we're very lucky because we have a very unique relationship with the Los Angeles Police Department, but it's taken a lot of years and a lot of pain and suffering to get to that point. But we do have credentials issued by the department, and that usually gives us more of a free pass, if you will, just in the city of Los Angeles. But in other surrounding areas, sometimes it's a little more challenging.
What can you tell us about some of the reports that some of the protesters have come in from other parts of the country, that they're not locals?
That happens a lot here because we're also a hotbed of immigration protests and immigration rallies and marches. That happens a lot when those types of protests happen here. And, you know, we're sort of the ground zero for protests in the United States. We have them in Los Angeles all of the time. Yes, we are seeing caravans coming up from other parts of the state of California. We're seeing people coming in from Arizona. Some people have come down from as far as Washington State, we're told. And this is also part and parcel to the...
Are they peaceful protesters, or are they the ones that have been rioting and looting?
Well, typically, Karina, the ones that come from the outside are mostly the agitators. But what I was going to say is that a lot of times we don't know that until the arrest records come out, and then we find out through arrest records what towns they're coming in from or what parts of the country they're coming in from. So far, most of the arrests have been people from the Southland, which is basically, you know, from Ventura County down to San Diego County. They've been in that particular region. The arrest records that I've seen thus far have seen nobody from out of state so far.
So you say the curfew seems to be holding. What have you experienced in the last few days while covering these protests?
Well, other than, as I mentioned last night, I was subject to being pulled over, searched, my vehicle searched because they were looking for looters. But in terms of covering this, it's exhausting, quite frankly. It is really exhausting because we're trying to keep up because like the police department, they have a little more intel than we do. But like the police department, all over the place too, we're trying to tell a story. Fortunately, we have a very large contingent or fleet of news helicopters here that sort of get to the story quicker, and we're able to get a better view of what's going on the ground. But basically what it's been like for us, it's been dangerous also. I've had 5 of my colleagues in the Los Angeles Press Corps attacked. Some have been hit with bottles and rocks. Others have been punched and jumped. So the hostility against reporters, there was a time when we were sort of immune and we were neutral observers, but now we're targets.
Tell us about some of those aerial pictures that we've been seeing on our screens that have been blasted out all over the world.
Well, here's the thing. This is a very visual story. And when you look at it from the air and you see just crowds, hundreds and hundreds of people, thousands of people gathered in one space, then, you know, that's a very, very poignant picture. Then when you see fire, when we've had many, many fires here breaking out, and at nighttime, that just makes it a real huge spectacle. You know, we got these balls of fire coming up out of these buildings and people's stores and dumpsters being lit on fire, police cars being lit on fire, these just constant bonfires all over the city of Los Angeles.